God of War Ragnarok is the 2022 sequel to the 2018 God of War reboot, which was updated with a free DLC expansion to become God of War Ragnarok Valhalla in 2023. Although for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to refer to the game as Ragnarok. It's a fantasy hack-and-slash game made by Santa Monica Studio, whose narrative seeks to wrap up the character arcs of Kratos and Atreus, as Atreus becomes his own man while exploring his own destiny, and Kratos makes peace between the man that he's been and the man that he's become. And without further ado, let's get into it. Ragnarok gives the player a lot to look forward to with regard to their upgrades. An element that carried over from God of War into this game is that your weapons and armor will change in appearance as they improve, although in Ragnarok, you actually get to see what these upgrades are going to look like before you get them. Likewise, not only does the game show you the appearance of equipment as you can potentially level them up, but you also get to see how their stats will change with time, and giving the player this foreknowledge opens up much more freedom when trying to figure out a build that works for you. For example, I barely used the default armor in the last game, but in this one, I actually kept Kratos' default armor for almost the entire playthrough, because upon inspection, it becomes a very solid all-around piece of armor by the endgame upgrade levels. The game is also designed in such a way as to guide the player using loot as a motivator, even sometimes based on their mistakes. An example of this is when you first enter the mines in Svartalfheim. You need to access this elevator, but it won't function if you go up to it. Sure, there's a solution available to you to prevent this from being a problem if you just explored around enough, but if you just beeline it for the elevator, turning around and leaving it will put you in a position where you will now see a chest. Even if you don't know where the solution is or where you're supposed to be going, now you're more likely to be hunting down that chest you saw, and by pursuing that chest, it will lead you to the solution that you need. In this way, the game has been designed to guide the player by taking advantage of player psychology in a way that doesn't make the player feel stupid for not immediately realizing solutions. The level design of Ragnarok is perfectly functional, such that there really isn't much to unpack here. It continues all the good hallmarks of intuitive level design found in the previous game, although adding a few new traversal mechanics to flesh it out. What there is a lot to talk about, however, is the world. In terms of world design, God of War Ragnarok does a magnificent job of evolving from the previous game. As a result of Fimbulwinter being in full swing, each realm is experiencing different ecological events. Midgard is a permafrosted wasteland, Vanaheim has greater humidity which is causing the predatory plants to grow out of control, and Svartalfheim smells like fart. And has earthquakes or whatever. In a vacuum, the realms are also visually distinct from one another, such that the player can recognize them on sight, and they feel as though they have a reason to exist apart from one another. Midgard doesn't look like Vanaheim, doesn't look like Svartalfheim, doesn't look like Muspelheim, doesn't look like Asgard, and so on. Having several levels that are all vastly different may then call the world's cohesion into question, but that issue is resolved by both the lore and the map. Each realm is, in lore, only one branching part of Yggdrasil, the World Tree, which serves as the metaphysical center of all 9 realms' existence. Also as Sindri's new house, seeing how the realm between realms is safe from Odin's prying eyes. Meanwhile, in the literal center is Tyr's Temple, the hub from the last game which houses the physical gateways to the 9 realms. Looking at the map while within each realm, you can find Tyr's Temple, even if it isn't somewhere that you get to physically explore. Having this detail in each map helps to bring unity to levels that may otherwise feel separated. It's going to be a very short stability section this time, because I went through the entire story with absolutely no glitches whatsoever, technically. The actual first glitch I experienced was during the epilogue sequence, so technically after the story was over, where Freya's lip flaps don't sync with her dialogue at all. They're well animated, and given the dialogue I know she's supposed to be saying, I can read her lips and tell what was supposed to match up where, but it was completely broken. Take a look.
It was taken from me piece by piece.
The only other glitch I really experienced was hours after that, when I was on my final session of Valhalla. for whatever reason, only in that very final play session did I ever experience significant frame drops. But it was a standalone oddity that I'm not going to hold against the game because it only happened once, and it was in the literal final half hour of 40 hours of gameplay. Hey there. Please, subscribe if you like these kinds of reviews. Remember that simple and honest communication can resolve most problems. Kratos, boy. And of course, beware spoilers from this point forward. One thing that you should be aware of in regards to Ragnarok's story is that this series of God of War games has very clear expectations for the player. Events are regularly referenced that were not necessary to beat the prior game's story. Rather, the story of this game expects you to know the conclusions of every major side quest in the previous game. Surtur's Trials, the Valkyries, even Andvari and the Alchemist's Ring comes up. Ragnarok is not, strictly speaking, a sequel to God of War, but to a 100% run of God of War. Ragnarok deals with a lot of heavy themes filtered through the lens of immensely flawed people trying to be better than they once were. Granted, one of the biggest topics of the game, free will versus destined fate, gets fumbled a little bit. After having the nature of predestination in this universe explained by the Norns, everything seems to progress smoothly from there, until in the climax where suddenly the grander points of the prophecies that we've seen come true for the entire game at this point just don't end as predicted, with only implied answers as to why. That one issue aside though, the cataclysm of Ragnarok is mostly set dressing for Atreus and Kratos to grow into the people they've been set up to become, and the narrative achieves this most obviously through callbacks to the previous game. Kratos becoming a much more caring father is foreshadowed when his words mirror Freya's from the last game. When she attempts to exonerate her anger and wrath towards Kratos after the years of fighting they had post-God of War, Kratos quotes her almost word for word from the time that he brought Atreus before her to be healed.
God. No need to explain. Not to me, not for that.
No need to explain. Not to me. Not for that.
This shows that, in subtle ways, both Freya and Kratos are becoming more like one another. When Freya says, "Not to me, not for that," it is in regards to understanding Kratos' bad experiences with gods and never trusting them again, something which she empathized with thanks to Odin. However, when Kratos says almost the exact same line, it's with regard to understanding her rage with him thanks to his killing of her son Baldur, a feeling that Kratos empathizes with both because Ares tricked him into killing his own family years ago, and because he recognizes that he would do the same if anyone killed Atreus. And speaking of, we see how the relationship between Kratos and Atreus has evolved first by how Kratos refers to him. Where in the last game Kratos almost exclusively called Atreus boy, now Kratos refers to him by name, only ever calling Atreus boy during a very specific instance of Atreus acting defiantly childish. We see the conclusion of this naming arc after the death of Brock, where after Atreus is disowned by his found family in Sindri, Kratos begins referring to Atreus not as boy, and not by the name that's been in contention for the entire story, but by what, be it Atreus or Loki, is, and always will be to Kratos.
Son.
And just as Kratos learns to care and trust, so too does Atreus learn to be a man. Atreus, admittedly through a lot of violent yet well-meaning disobedience that almost never goes well for him, solidifies his torn identity as both Atreus, the son of Kratos, and Loki, the son of the giants. He learns to accept that he must take responsibility for his actions, and starts down the path of learning to deal with both loss and his own mistakes, something which Kratos and Mimir know about all too well. We see that throughout the game, even after he's rebelled and fled to Asgard, Atreus is channeling his father's lessons to get him through his bad situation, and their respective arcs come to a beautiful conclusion as the curtains close on Odin. In the final moments of the game, Kratos, who has struggled to have any faith in Atreus' judgment for the entire game, says, "This is your choice, son. I trust you." And Atreus, upon Odin's defeat, makes one final plead to the fallen Allfather, saying to him one of Kratos' hallmark lessons: there is always a choice. We must be better. Now, under normal circumstances, that's where we would go to the mechanical design section, but then Atreus, now having reconciled how his identity relates to his father, sets off on his own adventure to finish reconciling the other half of his identity as it relates to the giants. And in his absence, Kratos finds himself a note, sending him on the finale of his individual character arc. While Ragnarok's story was about the evolving nature of the father-son relationship between Atreus and Kratos, and Atreus actualizing his personal identity, Kratos' personal arc this entire time for both games has been him learning to come to peace with himself and his past sins. Kratos and Mimir, at the behest of the mysterious note, force themselves into Valhalla seeking answers. Valhalla, as it turns out, is a combined and personalized heaven and hell. Those who enter are forced to fight the enemies of their past until they can make peace with themselves. Those who do find the heaven part. Those who do not, however, are doomed to fight their demons forever. Kratos has been called upon by Freya to pick up the mantle of God of War in the Nine Realms in order to establish peace and help handle conflict as they rebuild. But Kratos is still far too much at war with himself to accept any notion of becoming a formal god again. For this reason, Kratos was summoned by Tyr, the original god of war of the Nine Realms, so that he may finally break through his mental barriers and make peace with who he is and with who he's been. This leads Kratos into gauntlet after gauntlet and test after test by Tyr himself, until ultimately he comes face to face with the one person he hates more than any god of Olympus: himself. Accepting that while yes, he had done monstrous things, he is not only the monster. He is more than that. He always has been. He is a leader of men, a general, a father, a man convicted to set right the injustices that were caused to him and by him. In this realization, his younger self then fades, and Kratos resolves himself to serve, to put forth that which makes him more than the monster he had been. And once again, we witness as the god of war takes his throne. Ragnarok's mechanical depth is almost entirely combat-oriented, with about an 80-20 split between the skills and abilities dedicated to the player character versus the companion character. I say it that way because this time around there are several variations on what the party can look like. At different stages of the game, the player will control either Kratos or Atreus, and depending on the situation, Atreus, Sindri, Freya, or indeed no one at all may end up acting as the companion. Atreus and Freya have their respective skill trees, which will open up the longer the game goes on, although Sindri has none. The game adds mechanical depth by building upon the basis of the slow, heavy-hitting Leviathan Axe and the quick, combo-heavy Blades of Chaos by adding a third weapon between the two of them: the Draupnir Spear. It's a unique weapon in that it's not actually technically a spear at all, but a ring. It can reproduce an infinite number of itself, and thus can be thrown as a long-range projectile an unlimited number of times, with crowd control properties in the form of explosive spearheads that get left behind. If that wasn't enough though, the game also adds two additional elements to making your playstyle and the surrounding build: the Relic and the Amulet of Yggdrasil. The relics are most often remnants of ancient magical weapons that contain trace amounts of their original power. Kratos can use these relics for a moment to do things like push enemies away or get a burst of rage, and they become extremely useful when paired with builds that complement them. The amulet is essentially a secondary, piecemealed together skill tree, a sequence of buffs that you can equip and combine in different ways to improve Kratos' overall stats, and if done correctly, also gain passive or active abilities that trigger once certain conditions are met. Meanwhile, where the axe is a single target slugger weapon that applies frost and slows enemies, and the blades are fast crowd control weapons that apply burn and deal extra damage over time, the spear is a fast single target weapon that builds stun. In addition to arguably being the best long-range weapon of the game, the spear essentially does what Unarmed did in the last game, and in this game to be fair, only much better. The spear also offers some of the only new traversal mechanics, which feed into a bit of that Metroidvania level design that these new God of War games like to dabble with. You can use the spear to plug holes that are blowing torrents of wind, or use the exploding spearheads to destroy weakened sections of objects by forcing air into them and blowing them apart. Either way, they both provide players with new ways to explore the world and return visits once the player obtains the spear. We'll start off with one of the only negatives, which is something that the previous game also struggled with: the fact that many models are just reskins of one another. Although Santa Monica seemed intent on balancing that problem out this time. Yes, a bunch of equipment has at least one reskin, but it's usually only one, and there's more to pick from now. Yes, there are repeated bosses and mini-bosses, but there's actually a handful of different ones instead of having them all just be trolls. Side note, unscripted, the first time that you run into a troll in the game, you hit it with a train and Kratos insta-kills it in a cutscene. They really wanted to distance themselves from those trolls. Yes, the ogre's skeleton and animations get reused, but at least this time it's a new, fun monster type being pulled to pay homage to the original God of War games instead of actually just being a different colored ogre. For everything that gets copy-pasted, there is almost always one new thing that balances it out, which makes it much more forgivable this time. From there on, though, it does become a little bit difficult to write anything new in this section that wasn't said before in the previous review, because very little of either the visual or sound design language has been changed between games other than being cleaned up somewhat. That said, one of the coolest examples of communicating information to the player purely through visuals does take place in Valhalla. Tyr is the only other character to have a pair of Bifrost eyes other than Mimir, and they glow brightly while he's channeling his godly strength, only fading when he concedes the fight. Likewise, Tyr's outward appearance also evolves as you complete each run of Valhalla. On the first run, his appearance is very humble, wearing simple clothes, looking the same as when you first freed him in the mines in the early game. Although next time, he not only brings forth a new weapon, he is now donning his ornate armor from when he was God of War. Going forward, not only will he continue to bring forth new weapons on each successful run, and continue to wear his ceremonial armor, but he will begin to cover himself in magic like a warrior covers themselves in war paint. All of which continues until finally Kratos himself faces down a true God of War once again. Alright, listen, the gameplay is great, the game looks very, very pretty, but that story, bro. I admit I wasn't the biggest fan of Freya this time around, and again, the whole Destiny and Prophecy thing got handled a bit wonky, but there's so much to unpack here. Kratos' arc of controlling his rage and making peace with himself. Atreus discovering who he is and actualizing himself by making just every single possible mistake. And the relationships between these characters, Kratos and Atreus, Kratos and Freya, Atreus and Thrud, Thrud and Sif, Thor and Sif, Thor and Odin. The fact that Thor and Odin act as a dark mirror to Kratos and Atreus is spectacular, but let's not dance around the real character relationship here. Sindri is probably my favorite character in Ragnarok, and the story between him and Brock and the backstory you get with them is as heartwarming as it is soul-crushing. I could make an entire video just about Sindri and how he's handled in this game's story. I love it. All that said though, the game is weirdly going to get a 4 out of 5 opinion score, and the reason for that is the same reason that I enjoyed it so much. You can only experience a story for the first time, you know? I don't know how much, if at all, I'm going to go back and replay this game, and something I think about when I'm deciding whether or not I want to give a game a 4 or a 5 out of 5 is how much I see myself going back and playing it again. As much as I liked the last God of War, never played it again. And I don't expect that I will with either Ragnarok or Valhalla either, unless I do make more content. But enough about what I think. Is the game actually good?
Wow! Incredible!
Thank you guys so much for watching my first review of Year 4, and what a banger it was to start with too. You'll have to see my next tier list before you know how high in the S tier it landed, but we certainly started the year on a high note. Please consider supporting the channel by either becoming a member or a patron, and in the meantime, I've been LoneWolfyX, and I will see you, yes you, next time.